Andrew Phipps, you are Head of Business Development, EMEA and Global Futurist at Cushman and Wakefield. Thank you for joining us on BiTV.
It's an absolute pleasure to be here.
In a report published earlier this year, you mentioned that smart buildings have increased in prominence in the past decade. How do you define a smart building in 2022?
That's a really good question. And I think the reason we created the report was to try and help define what we believe a smart building is and what the future of smart buildings is over the course of the next decade. I think we've seen in the last sort of 10 years that the rise of buildings that could be called smart, that is those buildings that really understand their own operations and make recommendations as to changes that need to be done to be able to operate more successfully, have really grown. So I think the number of smart buildings that now produce huge volumes of data, huge volumes of recommendations are higher than ever. I think one of the things that perhaps we've struggled with in the past is really understanding how to make the most of the information provided. So it's great that a building can provide incredible intelligence around usage, around energy consumption, and around occupancy, all of those sort of things. But it only really is relevant if we actually make some changes or adjustments based on the data that we get from the buildings. So I think the best operators are the ones that actually take the information, benchmark it against other buildings they perhaps have access to data from, and then make changes accordingly, and then measure the changes made and make subsequent changes to ensure that the building continues to operate in the most efficient manner possible.
And speaking of that, what can smart building, intelligent building do for property investors and their tenants at the moment? And what can what do you foresee them doing in the future?
Yeah, and I think the most simple way to describe it for me would be around transparency. So I think what an intelligent building does is it allows the investor, the owner, the landlord, and the occupier real visibility of what's happening in that building at any one time. So then the best of the systems allow real-time monitoring and measuring. So it allows us to see how efficient the building's being. It allows the comparison of day over day, week over week, month over month, year over year. It's been incredibly useful during the return to the office post-COVID, where we've seen usage in building increasing fairly dramatically, and to be able to make decisions based on the data. So I think it just allows, for the first time perhaps, the ability to be able to measure both in financial terms the value of making changes to a building, but also in occupancy levels, in terms of lease length, in terms of lease renewal. So all the different things you always wondered about, how successful they've been, how impactful this particular change was, we're now able to look at via the data. And I think the key piece for me going forward is how smart buildings will help to enable more sustainable buildings. So we know that there's quite rightly a huge amount of talk about making buildings more sustainable, whether that be refurbishment or redesign or redevelop, whatever. But I think the ability to be able to measure energy in particular, lighting, heating, sound, etc., via smart intelligence just allows us to really demonstrate whether one building is more sustainable than another. And that's something that we're increasingly getting asked for by investors and occupiers. Is this a sustainable building? As a very broad question, but I think getting into the detail, we can actually tell them now, and I think that's going to fundamentally change real estate as we know it.
Okay. And therefore, looking at the future, your report reminds us that 80% of the 2050 building stock is already built. Is retrofitting existing assets the next frontier for the development of smart buildings? And maybe if so, what are some of the tips for investors looking to transform their portfolio?
Yeah, and that's a very live question. So we get asked that a lot. So should I divest certain buildings from my portfolio because either they're not sustainable or the cost to retrofit will be extremely high? And I think we're increasingly seeing a bit of a negative focus on that. So I think we as a society want to believe that owners of buildings assets are going to do the right things to make them to make them more sustainable and to improve them. The challenge with retrofit is that lots of smart building technology, lots of design ideas are much simpler when delivered as part of the design and first development building of an asset. When we're looking back to retrofit, it's slightly harder. We have now seen a large number of the companies offer smart intelligent solutions, recognizing this is a huge part of the market. As you said, 80% of the buildings, i.e. 80% of their customers, if you like, already exist. So how do you go about retrofitting those buildings? And I think the size of sensors, the Wi-Fi, the NFC, the Bluetooth capacity of all the development now allows things to be implemented with much less negative impact on the building. It's not a case of having to route things into walls, etc. They're just very small pieces of technology that are able to do the things that much bigger technology needed a few years ago. Everything goes up into the cloud, so we don't even need large server rooms, and it's all done on a much more simplistic basis. But 100% agree, retrofitting buildings with the technology is absolutely what we're going to see over the course of the next 5 years.
Great. Andrew Phipps, it was a pleasure having you with us today. Thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us and for your insight. And thank you all for joining us, and see you soon on BiTV.